Marcos stepped onto the jet bridge with the posture of a man who knew how to own a room. But his chest carried the weight of someone who had just walked out of a hospital room without knowing if he'd see the same eyes again. The logo of his company on his carry-on bag gleamed under the airport lights, a tiny symbol of the empire he'd built. Yet it felt ridiculous compared to the image burning in his mind. Anna, pale and exhausted, whispering that he should go, that the conference in Berlin mattered, that the world wouldn't wait. His fingers still felt the softness of Clara's tiny hand gripping his thumb that morning, as if their daughter could sense that something in their universe was off balance. Power had never felt so fragile. For years, he had believed that money, influence, and genius could bend reality. Now, the only truth that mattered was that he could lose everything that truly counted while still being celebrated on magazine covers. He walked through the cabin and settled into his seat in business class, automatically hanging his jacket and placing his silent suitcase overhead. Inside it were contracts, presentations, a top-of-the-line laptop, and a small baby teether that had ended up there by accident during the chaotic rush to leave the apartment. The faint smell of home hit him like a punch. He closed his eyes for a second, feeling his carefully constructed image cracking from the inside. People around him adjusted their seats, debated wine choices, made casual jokes about turbulence. They saw a successful CEO traveling for another big event, not a man bargaining with the universe, trying to hide his fear in the shadows of routine. A part of him almost envied their ignorance. Another part felt the quiet sting of symbolic revenge, life now reminding him that no title could negotiate with the fragility of a heartbeat. The flight attendants moved with that smooth, choreographed efficiency that usually comforted him. Today, it just made him feel more trapped. He pulled out his phone and stared at the last message from the doctor. "We're monitoring, no significant change. Fly carefully." Such calm words for such a violent uncertainty. His thumb hovered over the call button, then retreated. What if he called and the truth came crashing through in one sentence? Cowardice wrapped itself around his rational mind. He turned the phone screen off and placed it on the tray table, face down, as if that gesture could keep bad news from finding him. Deep down, he knew he wasn't hiding from fate. He was hiding from his own inability to control it. Around him, conversations blended into a low hum. A middle-aged couple discussed hotel options in Berlin. A younger man bragged softly about his startup's latest funding round. Someone complained about legroom, even in business class. It was almost absurd. How could the world sound so normal when his own life felt suspended over a cliff? He took a slow breath, adjusting his tie, pretending to review a presentation on his tablet, but the words blurred into nonsense. The numbers, charts and optimistic forecasts about a new AI platform for healthcare felt like a cruel joke now. He had poured millions into algorithms that claimed to predict cardiac risks, and yet his wife lay in a hospital bed, stubbornly immune to all that cleverness. The truth was simple and brutal. For all his brilliance, he was helpless where it mattered most. The doors closed, trapping the mixture of perfumes, tension, and unspoken stories inside the plane. The crew performed the safety demonstration, and he barely glanced at the instructions he had seen 100 times. Put on your own mask first, then help others. The irony didn't escape him. He'd spent years putting on masks. The visionary, the negotiator, the flawless leader. Now he couldn't even breathe properly for himself. As the plane began to taxi, he finally switched his phone to airplane mode, a tiny act that felt like cutting his last line to the world he was desperate to monitor. His heart beat faster, half expecting a last-second notification before the signal dropped. Nothing came. Silence invaded the device, but not his mind. The engines roared and the plane surged forward. Outside, the lights of Madrid streaked by and began to shrink as the aircraft lifted into the night sky. Gravity pushed him back into his seat, while his life felt like it was pulling in the opposite direction. High above the city where he'd once dreamed of escaping poverty, He now felt like a prisoner of his own success. The plane leveled and the seatbelt sign chimed off. People relaxed, reclined, ordered drinks. He reached for water instead of wine, unwilling to blur the raw edges of his anxiety. He wanted to remember every second, to feel every thread of this fear, as if staying lucid could somehow protect Anna and Clara from the worst. A sharp, high-pitched cry cut through the cabin's comfortable murmur. It wasn't loud at first, but it carried that particular tone that makes heads turn. His body reacted faster than his mind. His muscles tensed, his breath caught, his eyes snapped open. For an instant, the sound transformed into Clara's voice in his imagination, pulling him back to those nights when she had wailed for reasons neither he nor Anna could decipher. The cry came again, this time louder, more desperate, coming from behind the dividing curtain that separated business from economy. Conversations faltered. A few people sighed in annoyance. Someone muttered something under their breath about babies on flights. He turned in his seat, trying to catch a glimpse through the small gap between the curtain and the cabin wall. He couldn't see much, just movement and a flicker of light. Another cry erupted, then a broken, gasping sob, the kind that signals more than simple discomfort. His pulse quickened. A strange mixture of empathy and dread washed over him. He knew how vulnerable a tiny body could be, how quickly things could spiral beyond anyone's control. Nearby, a man in a suit rolled his eyes and shook his head as if the crying were an inconvenience on the same level as delayed service. The casual cruelty of that reaction hit harder than expected. The flight attendant nearest to the curtain hesitated for a moment, then stepped through with calm urgency. The crying didn't stop. The sound grew more chaotic, more raw, as if the little lungs were begging the sky itself for relief. A woman's shaky voice tried to soothe between sobs, failing miserably. The energy in the cabin shifted. Even those pretending not to care couldn't fully ignore it. The thin wall between comfort and terror felt like it was dissolving. A quiet request sounded through the speakers, asking if there was any medical professional on board. The words were spoken in a measured tone, but everyone heard the subtext. This might be serious. A man, a few rows behind Marcos, raised his hand and stood, introducing himself briefly as a pediatric nurse. He moved with calm efficiency toward the back, disappearing behind the curtain. For a moment, hope fluttered through the tension, but the crying still didn't calm. The child's panic filled the space between the seats, bouncing off screens and champagne flutes. Up here, where status usually defined who mattered, it was now clear that the most important life in this metal tube was the smallest one, unseen by most. No stock price, no quarterly report, no polished speech came close to the urgency of that sound. As he watched, something else moved in the corner of his eye. A teenager near the middle rows of economy slowly unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. He wore a faded hoodie, jeans that had clearly endured more than a few years of use, and sneakers with scuffed edges. At his feet, an old backpack patched with duct tape and covered in worn-out fabric badges rested like a loyal companion. Nothing about him suggested power, privilege, or authority. Yet his posture, once he stood, carried a quiet determination that made him stand out in a cabin full of people trying not to get involved. He glanced toward the source of the crying, then toward the crew, then back again, his jaw tightening as if making a decision. For a second, he seemed ready to sit back down, swallowed by the silent pressure to stay in his place. Then another broken cry from the baby shook him out of hesitation. He stepped into the aisle and began moving toward the sound, his movements cautious but deliberate. A few passengers looked annoyed, interpreting his action as interference. One man muttered something about kids always wanting attention. Another stared at him, with the kind of suspicion reserved for those who don't fit the unspoken dress code of the cabin. None of them knew where he came from or why he was on this flight. None of them suspected that the most valuable knowledge on board might be hidden inside that duct-taped backpack. From his seat, Marcos watched the scene unfold, curiosity mixing with a faint discomfort. He recognized that look of defiance on the boy's face, the look of someone who had been underestimated one time too many and had decided at some point to stop asking for permission to care. It reminded him of a version of himself he hadn't seen in the mirror for years, a younger man who once pushed against gates that weren't built for him. Success had buried that memory under layers of tailored suits and executive lounges. The truth of who he had been before power arrived was still there, somewhere, struggling to breathe under his own shadows. The teenager reached the row where the crying came from and crouched slightly, trying to make eye contact with the adult holding the baby. The pediatric nurse was already there, checking the child's breathing, color, and general responsiveness. The boy didn't interfere. Instead, he waited until the nurse looked his way and then spoke quietly, gesturing to his backpack. Something about his calm presence must have been convincing enough, because the nurse nodded. The boy unzipped the top of the backpack and pulled out a small, homemade device made of wires, sensors, and a tiny speaker. It looked like a school project that had survived too many bus rides. He tapped the device with his thumb to power it on. A soft, rhythmic sound emerged, a repeating pattern of low pulses designed to mimic the steady beat of a human heartbeat. The boy glanced at the mother, asking permission with his eyes. She nodded through her tears, clutching the baby tighter. The nurse carefully helped position the device close to the child, near the little chest. At the same time, the boy reached out slowly, offering one finger instead of a full hand, letting the baby choose contact rather than forcing it. After a few seconds, the tiny fingers clung to his. The child's cries wavered, then shifted into uneven sobs, then into hiccuping breaths as the body tried to recalibrate. The entire section around them held its breath. The boy began to speak, barely above a whisper, his words steady and reassuring. He asked the mother to mirror his breathing, in slowly through the nose, out through the mouth, counting softly. He kept his gaze fixed on the baby, following every micro-change in expression, ready to adjust. His own shoulders relaxed deliberately, modeling calm for the adults as much as for the child. What he was doing wasn't magic. It was the layered result of years watching younger cousins, neighbors' kids, and siblings of friends lose control in cramped apartments and noisy streets where no expert ever came when panic took over. His laboratory had been real life. Gradually, the baby's crying diminished to low whimpers, then to small, shaky sounds as exhaustion replaced panic. The device kept its gentle, rhythmic pulse, like a mechanical heart, lending its tempo to the fragile body. The color in the baby's face improved. The nurse checked vital signs again and nodded, clearly impressed. The mother finally allowed herself to exhale deeply, tears still streaming, but now mixed with relief. A wave of tension released across the rows nearby. A couple of people even clapped quietly before stopping, as if afraid to break the fragile peace that had just been rebuilt. Standing a few rows away, half of his body still in the business cabin, Marcos felt emotions he hadn't allowed himself in a long time. Gratitude toward a stranger, admiration that didn't depend on a title or salary, a sting of shame for all the times he had judged someone at a glance. The boy, who by all external measures should have been invisible on a flight like this, had just done what those with more resources hadn't even tried. He had stepped toward the crying instead of away from it. In a world obsessed with grand gestures and polished narratives, this simple act of courage shone like a quiet rebellion against indifference. As the boy returned to his seat, a few people nodded at him, awkwardly thankful. Others avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with how his presence challenged their assumptions. The duct-taped backpack slid back under his feet, once again just a piece of worn fabric in the shadows of the cabin. But something fundamental had shifted. The flight, which had started as another routine journey from one powerful city to another, now carried a different energy. A silent line had been drawn between those who stayed seated and those who chose to move. And somewhere between Madrid and Berlin, a man used to controlling billions, realized that the most valuable person on that plane might be a teenager who had just proven, in front of everyone, that truth and compassion can quietly defeat the shadows of apathy. For a while, the plane floated in a strange, gentle silence, as if everyone needed a moment to recalibrate. The baby had finally surrendered to sleep, cheeks still damp, tiny chest moving in steady rhythm. The mother kept whispering thank yous to anyone who made eye contact, but her gaze always drifted back to the boy with the patched backpack. He didn't seem to know what to do with the gratitude. He just shrugged it off, pulled his hood back a little, and stared at the safety card as if it were the most fascinating thing in the world. Attention clearly made him uncomfortable, which only made his earlier courage more striking. Marcos couldn't sit still. Something in him resisted returning to slides and numbers as if nothing meaningful had happened. He loosened his seatbelt, stood up, and stepped through the thin curtain that separated his expensive seat from the rows where people had less space, but apparently more humanity tonight. As he walked down the aisle, he felt eyes on him, the reflexive curiosity people have when someone from the front of the plane walks to the back. He ignored it. His focus was locked on that worn hoodie and the rectangle of duct tape barely holding the backpack's side pocket together. He stopped beside the boy's row and spoke softly so as not to wake the baby a few seats away. "Hey," he said, his voice lower and less polished than the one he used on stages. That was impressive. The boy looked up, surprised, then quickly scanned his face like someone used to measuring adults in a split second, trying to guess whether this was praise, mockery, or some kind of trouble. There was a brief pause, where both seemed suspended between worlds, one shaped by conference halls and stock markets, the other by crowded buses and second-hand devices. Finally, the boy gave a small nod. "She just needed something steady to hold on to," he replied. "Babies are honest. They don't pretend they're fine when they're not." The sentence hit harder than it had any right to. Babies are honest. Adults, on the other hand, perfected the art of hiding behind silence and polite lies. Marcos felt a strange mix of shame and admiration, as if the universe had just slipped a small piece of truth into the conversation, disguised as teenage common sense. He gestured to the empty seat across the aisle. "Mind if I sit for a minute?" The boy shrugged, a gesture that meant yes without daring to say it too eagerly. The CEO of a global tech company carefully lowered himself into a cramped economy seat, his knees almost touching the tray table, feeling for the first time in a long time that he might actually be exactly where he needed to be. Up close, the backpack looked even more like a timeline of survival. Frayed straps re-sewn with mismatched thread, faded logos nearly swallowed by time, a small metal keychain shaped like a robot dangling from the zipper. Marcos nodded toward it. "You built that little device yourself?" he asked. The boy's eyes lit up for a fraction of a second, the way they had when the baby first grabbed his finger. "Yeah," he said. "It's part of a bigger project I'm taking to Berlin. I didn't design it for planes, though. It's for kids who panic in noisy environments. You know, sirens, shouting, that kind of thing." His accent carried the rough musicality of Liverpool, each syllable colored by a life far from glossy headquarters. "So you're going to Berlin for what exactly?" Marcos asked, even though he already suspected the answer. The boy straightened slightly. "An international robotics competition," he said. "My school couldn't really pay for everything, so some local folks chipped in, and I fixed things for people to cover the rest." He smiled briefly, then hid it, as if joy was something he wasn't yet used to displaying openly. There it was, the outline of a story that had nothing to do with privilege and everything to do with persistence. The kind of narrative that doesn't usually get a microphone, but when it does, changes the way people look at themselves. He introduced himself simply, Leo Carter. No titles, no explanations. Just a name used to being attached to modest expectations. Marcos hesitated, wondering if saying his full identity would make things weird. He settled for, "I'm Marcos," The surname could wait. For once, he didn't want the weight of his company to walk in before he did. "That thing you built," he added, nodding again to the backpack. "You realized what the baby needed faster than most adults here, including me." Leo shrugged again, more out of habit than indifference. "When you grow up around noise and chaos, you learn to read panic," he said. "And you figure out pretty quickly that nobody's coming to save you unless you start moving first." That line settled between them like a small, undeniable truth. From his polished life, Marcos had long outsourced discomfort, delegating anything messy to teams, advisors, and experts. Leo, on the other hand, had grown up in a world where delegation wasn't an option. If something was broken, either you learned how to fix it, or it stayed broken. No middle ground, no rescue team. In a strange way, they were both chasing different versions of the same thing, control over a world that refused to be tamed. One had done it with money and influence. The other was doing it with soldering irons, cheap sensors, and late nights spent teaching himself more than anyone had formally taught him. A nearby passenger leaned slightly over the armrest, curiosity finally winning over politeness. "How did you even know what to do with that kid?" she asked Leo, her tone softer than before. Just an hour earlier, she had frowned at the first cries. Now, she sounded almost grateful that someone younger than her had stepped up when she hadn't. Leo scratched the back of his neck, clearly not ready to become the center of attention. "You watch enough babies freak out in buses and clinics," he said. "You pick up patterns. Noise goes up, breathing goes crazy, body goes stiff. If you can give them one thing that feels predictable, a sound, a touch, a rhythm, their brain starts to come back from the dark." The woman nodded slowly, absorbing the explanation as if he'd just summarized years of psychology in a few sentences. Marcos noticed how naturally Leo translated complex reactions into simple words. No slides, no jargon, no graphs, just observations from a life that had forced him to turn survival into a science. It dawned on him that brilliance doesn't always wear the clothes he was used to. Sometimes it wears threadbare hoodies and carries its ideas in patched bags instead of polished briefcases. And sometimes it sits in the back of a plane, quietly waiting for a moment to prove that the truth about value and potential isn't what most people believe. When the flight attendants came by again, offering drinks and snacks, something had shifted in their demeanor too. One of them paused beside Leo and said, "That was really kind, what you did back there." Her eyes carried genuine respect, not the scripted warmth she used for frequent flyers. Leo mumbled a shy thanks and tried to disappear behind the plastic cup of juice, but it was too late. A few rows away, a businessman who had earlier scoffed at the crying child now looked at Leo with grudging admiration. Even those who might never admit it out loud had felt the quiet sting of being outclassed in courage by a 17-year-old. Back in his seat, Marcos picked up his tablet again but found the graphs even more hollow than before. The projection lines meant little compared to the arc his own life was taking at that exact moment. Something about Leo's presence had put a crack in his neatly controlled identity. The boy had no legal department, no PR agency, no board approving his moves, yet he had done something immediately useful, undeniably human, and surprisingly innovative in a crisis. That thought wouldn't let go. On the screen, market predictions scrolled by, but in his mind, a different question formed. How many Leos had he never seen, even when they'd been right in front of him, hidden in the shadows of systems built to reward a very specific kind of success? The engines hummed with monotone regularity, and outside, the darkness of the night sky stretched, indifferent to human dramas. Inside, though, worlds were quietly colliding. A CEO who had climbed out of a poor neighborhood in Madrid without looking back too often was now being forced to reconsider what he owed to the kid inside him who once felt like Leo. A teenager from a working-class corner of Liverpool, heading to Berlin with hope stuffed into a duct-tape backpack, had just gotten his first taste of what it felt like to be taken seriously beyond his own streets. Their paths had crossed by chance, but the more time passed, the less it felt like coincidence. Sometimes the universe arranges its own kind of revenge against indifference, making sure that the truth about human worth leaks through the cracks of comfort. As the cabin lights dimmed for the night portion of the flight, a calm settled over most passengers. Screens went dark, blankets were pulled up, eye masks appeared. The baby, now deeply asleep, rested quietly in her mother's arms, a tiny island of peace after a storm. In that hush, thoughts grew louder. Marcos leaned his head back and let his mind drift to Anna in the hospital. Would she approve of him being here? Would she understand that he had needed to fly, even with terror clawing at his ribs? He pictured her smile, the way she always cut through his grand plans, with a simple reminder, remember where you came from. For the first time that night, he wondered if this flight was less about Berlin and more about bringing him face to face with that reminder in human form. Near the back, Leo closed his eyes but didn't sleep. He was rehearsing code in his head, running logic through invisible circuits, imagining the final adjustments he would have to make once he reached the competition. Yet his thoughts kept wandering back to the baby's fingers gripping his. It wasn't the first time he'd calmed a panicked child, but it was the first time anyone had really noticed. On his street, you just did what you could and carried on. There were no applause, no headlines, just another day you got through without getting swallowed by the shadows. Up here, though, above the clouds, it felt like the truth of that quiet skill had finally found a stage, even if tiny and temporary. If someone watching this story from the outside were to pause the scene here, they might recognize themselves in one of these characters. Maybe as the parent trying not to fall apart, maybe as the passenger pretending the crying doesn't get under their skin, maybe as the kid who always steps in but never gets called a hero. And if that recognition stings a bit or warms something inside, that's exactly the kind of moment worth holding on to, the kind you might want to revisit, reflect on, or even use as a turning point for your own next chapter. After all, the stories we choose to keep close tend to be the ones that push us, gently or not, to look at our own shadows and choose a different truth. Berlin greeted them with a sky the color of brushed steel and air that smelled faintly of rain and coffee. As the plane taxied to the gate, Marcos glanced at his phone. The second airplane mode could be turned off, heart pounding as if each bar of signal were a verdict. A flood of notifications came in, emails, calendar reminders, news alerts, but none from the hospital. No missed calls, no new messages from Anna's doctor. Relief and fear tangled together. No news might be good news, or it might simply mean that the worst hadn't happened yet. He typed a quick message to the medical team, then hesitated, fingers freezing above the screen. Instead, he wrote to Anna, "Landed, thinking of you and Clara every second." He stared at the words before hitting send, as if they were too small for the weight they carried. The passengers shuffled out, forming the usual impatient line in the aisle. From where he stood, Marcos could see Leo a few rows ahead, wresting his battered backpack from the overhead bin. For a brief second, the boy's eyes met his, and there was a flicker of recognition. Not the awe people usually directed at him, but something more level, almost like a silent nod between two people who'd shared a strange night in the air. At the terminal, their paths almost split. Marcos was meant to be picked up by a sleek black car with tinted windows and a driver holding a sign. Leo followed the signs toward public transport, the backpack weighing more on one shoulder than the other. Something in that image tugged at him. Before he could overthink it, Marcos called out, "Leo!" The teenager turned, surprised to hear his name in that crowded space. Marcos caught up, feeling oddly out of place without his usual entourage. "Do you have someone meeting you here?" he asked. Leo shook his head. "Nah, I've got directions, train, then a bus. It's not my first time being lost somewhere new," he said with a half-smile that didn't fully hide the anxiety in his eyes. There was no complaint in his tone, just acceptance. For him, navigating unfamiliar cities without a safety net was normal. For Marcos, It was a reminder of a life he'd worked hard to leave behind. That didn't mean he should forget it existed. They walked together for a moment, carried forward by the current of travelers. "Which place are you staying?" Marcos asked. Leo pulled a crumpled sheet of paper from his pocket, the name of a low-budget hostel scribbled in blue ink, along with a list of bus lines. "It's cheap and close enough to the venue," he explained, almost defensively, as if bracing for judgment. Instead, Marcos just nodded. "Berlin can be confusing if it's your first time," he said. "I know it's not your style to ask for help, but if you don't mind riding in an unnecessarily fancy car, we're probably going the same way." He tried to say it lightly, like a joke, to soften the imbalance. Leo hesitated, then gave a small nod. Pride and practicality wrestled inside him, and practicality, for once, won. In the car, the contrast was jarring. Leather seats, bottled water, soft music, and a silent driver who had been briefed to anticipate needs before they were voiced. Leo sat on the edge of the seat at first, as if afraid to disturb anything. His backpack rested awkwardly on his knees, every patch and frayed edge suddenly louder in that pristine space. Marcos noticed the tension and said, "You look like you're sitting in a museum where you're not allowed to touch anything." Leo laughed, the sound quick and involuntary. "It's just different," he admitted. "Back home, if a car like this drove down my street, people would probably assume it was lost or very, very brave." The mention of back home opened a door. With gentle questions and long pauses that left space instead of pressure, Marcos began to piece together the landscape of Leo's world. A small flat in a crowded building in Liverpool. A mum who worked night shifts and came home smelling like cleaning products and cheap coffee. A father who existed more in stories than in real life, fading further with each year. Neighbors who blasted music at odd hours. Kids who learned to sleep through sirens and shouting. A school that didn't quite know what to do with someone who spent more time taking apart broken electronics than memorizing formulas from the board. Leo talked about fixing things, radios, old game consoles, phones nobody wanted to pay to repair properly. "If you can bring something back to life, people start to look at you differently," he said. "At first, they just stand there and watch, waiting to see if you fail, but when the thing turns on again, their face changes. For a few seconds, they forget everything else. That look, it keeps you going." His voice carried a quiet intensity, the kind that belongs to someone who has turned necessity into expertise. Marcos recognized that hunger. It was the same fire that had pushed him out of his own rough neighborhood years ago, fueled by the same need to prove that he was more than his circumstances. In return, he offered fragments of his own past, pieces he didn't usually share in interviews. Growing up in a cramped apartment in Madrid, parents constantly worried about bills, the hum of old appliances and thin walls. Late nights studying not in quiet libraries, but at the small kitchen table while conversations and TV sounds bled through from next door. The feeling of walking into his first university building and wondering if someone would stop him at the door and tell him they'd made a mistake. As he spoke, he realized how rarely he had allowed himself to remember those details without turning them into a heroic narrative. With Leo, he didn't need to dress them up. The boy understood that survival doesn't feel glamorous from the inside. The car dropped Leo near his hostel first. It was a narrow building squeezed between a cafe and a small supermarket, its facade covered in stickers and faded posters for long-past events. He unbuckled, one foot already on the pavement, then turned back. "Thanks," he said, and this time the word sounded heavier. "For the ride and for listening, I guess." Marcos nodded. "You're not here by accident, Leo," he said. "Not in Berlin, not on that flight. Don't forget that when you walk into that competition hall." The boy gave a quick half salute with 2 fingers to his forehead, an unconscious gesture of respect he'd probably picked up from movies, then disappeared through the hostel door, swallowed by the lobby's warm yellow light. Later that evening, the hotel where Marcos was staying felt more like a stage set than a place of rest. The minimalist design, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the curated art on the walls, everything was carefully arranged to whisper, "You have made it." Yet he felt strangely out of place in his own supposed success. After checking in, he sat on the edge of the bed and finally received the call he'd been waiting for from Madrid. The doctor's voice carried clinical calm. Anna was stable, no major change, but no new crisis either. Clara had eaten, cried, slept, repeated. For now, the worst had not come. He thanked the doctor, ended the call, and let out a shaky breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding since takeoff. But relief wasn't the only emotion rising in him. Alongside it came an uneasy question. What exactly was he doing with all his power, if a kid like Leo had to depend on community fundraisers and a patchwork of favors just to stand in the same room as others who'd been groomed for those stages their whole lives? He pulled up the event schedule on his tablet, scrolling past his own keynote time slot and sponsor mentions until he reached the section listing the youth robotics competition. There, in small print among dozens of team names, was Leo's. It didn't jump out. No bold formatting, no special logo, just a line in a long list. And yet, to him now, that name felt like a hidden spark in a field of carefully arranged lights. The next morning, the competition venue buzzed with nervous energy. The hall was enormous, lined with banners from sponsors and flags from different countries. Tables were arranged in rows, each one cluttered with laptops, toolkits, and partially assembled robots. Groups in matching t-shirts clustered together, chanting motivational phrases in their own languages. Coaches barked last-minute instructions, trying to pour years of training into a few rapid-fire sentences. Volunteers handed out badges, schedules, and maps. The air vibrated with possibility and quiet fear. It was an arena, just not the gladiator kind. This one traded swords for circuits, armor for algorithms. Marcos blended into the crowd more easily than usual, wearing a simple jacket instead of his usual tailored armor. He didn't head to the VIP area right away. Instead, he walked the aisles, eyes scanning name tags until he spotted a familiar silhouette leaning over a table, hands buried in a mess of wires. Leo stood beside 3 other teenagers, all in clean, branded shirts representing an institution that clearly had more funding than his school back home. Their posture said everything. They were used to being the smartest in the room. Leo's hoodie and accent carved him out as an outsider instantly. One of the boys rolled his eyes as Leo suggested a wiring change, responding loud enough for nearby teams to hear, "We've trained for this for years, mate. Just don't break anything, yeah." It was the kind of comment designed to sting, while still sounding technically polite. The others smirked. Leo's jaw tightened, but he didn't snap back. He'd heard variations of that line his whole life. Instead, he turned his focus back to the tangle of components, eyes moving in quick, analytical patterns. The robot on the table was sleek, but flawed. Marcos, even from a distance, could tell that some connections were more decorative than functional. Features included because they sounded good in theory, not because they solved real problems. It was a familiar pattern, form over substance, presentation over truth. He watched as Leo quietly began rerouting a set of cables, fingers moving, with the confidence of someone who had done this more times than he could count. One of the coaches, a tall man with neat glasses and the permanent squint of someone constantly evaluating potential, approached the table. "How's the final calibration?" he asked the group, voice brisk. Before anyone else could answer, Leo spoke up. "The sensor array was overloading the main board. I've isolated the signal paths so it doesn't fry during the stress test," he said. The coach looked slightly taken aback, as if not expecting the rough-around-the-edges kid to be the one with the most precise technical update. "And you are?" the man asked. Leo straightened. "I'm Leo. I joined the team last minute, from Liverpool." The coach glanced from him to the neatly dressed trio and back again, then gave a curt nod. "Keep me posted," he said, already turning away. It wasn't much, but it was something, acknowledgement, however brief. From a few meters away, Marcos felt frustration flare in his chest. He knew that tone. He'd used it himself in boardrooms, dismissing quietly brilliant people because they didn't fit the molded profile he'd been trained to recognize. Watching Leo navigate this subtle underestimation was like watching a replay of his own past, except this time he was on the observing side, not the receiving one. It forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. In climbing so high, he'd become part of the very machinery that once tried to keep him out. The revenge he thought he'd achieved against the system by succeeding inside it now felt incomplete, maybe even hollow, if he didn't also help rewrite the rules for others. As the first rounds of the competition began, teams presented their robots through timed challenges. Some machines moved with elegant efficiency, others sputtered, froze, or veered off course in dramatic failures. The crowd reacted with cheers, sympathetic groans, and bursts of laughter. When Leo's team stepped up for their initial test, tension wrapped itself around the small group like a band. The polished trio took the lead verbally, explaining the robot's purpose, an autonomous unit designed to monitor environmental conditions and flag potential health risks in densely populated areas. It sounded impressive. On paper, it probably was, but execution, as always, was where truth would show itself. The robot rolled forward, sensors blinking. For a few glorious seconds, it behaved perfectly, weaving around obstacles, transmitting data, responding to prompts. Then, as if overwhelmed, its movements jerked. Lights flickered. A faint, burning smell rose from its core. Something inside had overheated. On the sidelines, other teams watched with a mixture of sympathy and barely concealed satisfaction. Public failure has a way of bringing out old shadows in people: envy, relief, vindication. The judges made notes, faces neutral. The coach's jaw clenched. One of Leo's teammates hissed under his breath, "What did you touch, Liverpool?" as if the floor had been imported along with him. Leo's face flushed, not with guilt, but with the frustration of seeing a problem he hadn't been allowed to fully solve. "The issue was already there," he said evenly. "I told you last night the power distribution wasn't balanced. It's not about looking good under the lights. It's about not cooking the board." His teammate scoffed, but the coach heard the exchange, eyes narrowing behind his glasses. A seed of doubt had been planted, not about Leo's competence, but about who truly understood the machine on that table. Sometimes the first crack in an assumption comes not from a heroic moment, but from a barely audible argument at the edge of a crowded hall. Through it all, Marcos watched, feeling like he was standing at the edge of two worlds overlapping. On one side, the polished, sponsor-backed landscape of innovation as a show. On the other, the raw, improvised resilience of those like Leo, who had turned survival itself into a form of engineering. The more he observed, the clearer it became. The real competition here wasn't just between robots. It was between stories. The ones backed by resources and prestige, and the ones forced to fight for a few seconds of recognition. And even in this noisy arena, his own truth was getting harder to ignore. If he walked away after his keynote and left everything as it was, he'd be siding with the shadows that once tried to swallow him, whether he admitted it or not. The hall slowly emptied after the first rounds, but the tension didn't go anywhere. It just changed clothes. That night, the city lights of Berlin glowed beyond the hostel window, while Leo sat at a shared table, the robot's open chassis in front of him. His teammates had drifted off one by one, some to sleep, some to message friends, some to scroll through social feeds, nursing their frustration in silence. He stayed, a barely working lamp threw yellow light over the table, highlighting the maze of wires and boards he'd already begun to rearrange. For him, this wasn't a school project or a line on a resume. It was a test of everything he believed about himself. If he could make this thing work under unfair conditions, maybe that meant the truth about his value wasn't just a story he told himself in the dark. Across town, in a far more comfortable room, Marcos sat with his laptop open but ignored. The cityscape was framed perfectly by the hotel window. an image designed for social media posts about life at the top. He wasn't in the mood to celebrate. The faces from the competition hall replayed in his mind, the dismissive looks at Leo's hoodie, the way his ideas were half heard, the embarrassment when the robot faltered. He knew that feeling too well to pretend it didn't bother him. He picked up his phone, scrolled past messages from partners and organizers, and stopped on the competition schedule again. Tomorrow, final challenge. Open problem. Design a solution for disease spread in vulnerable communities. It was as if the universe had written a prompt tailored to collide both their worlds. Sleep didn't come easily to either of them. Leo counted blocks of code and voltage margins instead of sheep. Somewhere between recalculating load distributions and sketching new sensor arrangements on the back of an old receipt, his thoughts drifted to the baby on the plane, the way her fingers had wrapped around his. The way her mother had looked at him as if, for a moment, he'd been something more than the kid from the estate who's good with wires. That look burned in his chest, both comforting and terrifying. It whispered that maybe the things he'd learned in the shadows, on the streets, on borrowed devices, in crowded rooms, weren't just survival tricks. Maybe they were worth bringing into the light. Marcos, staring at the ceiling, realized that his entire talk for the conference felt wrong now. He'd planned to present Rivera Tech as the hero of a new era in digital health, but after watching Leo improvise with almost nothing, the speech sounded hollow in his own ears. The revenge he'd once wanted against the world that doubted him had turned into something else over the years, a quiet agreement to play by the same rules, just from a higher seat. The image of Leo bending over that table, resoldering wires under bad lighting, wouldn't leave him. Neither would the memory of his own nights at a tiny kitchen table in Madrid, trying to stretch cheap components and impossible dreams. Somewhere along the way, he'd left that boy behind. Maybe it was time to go back and get him. Morning arrived too bright, too early. At the venue, the final challenge was announced to a packed crowd. Each team would be given access to a simulated model of a densely populated community facing an outbreak. They had to design and demonstrate a robotic data system that could not just predict the disease spread, but actively reduce it. Most teams immediately dove into optimization talk, graphs, route efficiencies, resource distribution. On paper, it made sense, but paper didn't cry, panic, or get ignored in waiting rooms. Paper had never watched a neighbor decide between buying medicine or paying rent. Leo had. He stood a little apart, listening, his mind connecting scenes from home to scenarios on the screen in front of them. His teammates argued over which metrics would impress the judges most. "We need a strong visualization," one insisted. "If it looks complex enough, they'll know we know what we're doing," another suggested, focusing on prediction accuracy above all. Leo cleared his throat. "What if we focused on access instead?" he said. "It's not just about where the disease goes. It's about where help doesn't." They stared at him. He continued, cautiously. "On my street, people don't always trust official systems, but they trust the kids who fix their phones, the neighbor who always knows what bus to catch, the lady who organizes the food lines. We could design the robot to work with people like that. Use them as nodes. Spread information and resources, not just data." They frowned, some visibly, some only, in the tightening around their eyes. It wasn't that they couldn't understand the concept. It was that they weren't used to thinking of informal structures as part of the solution. The coach, however, was listening. "Explain," he said simply, folding his arms. Leo took a breath and stepped closer to the simulation. "Look, prediction means nothing if the people at the end of the map don't change what they're doing," he said. "But if your system recognizes who the community already follows, the ones who calm the crying kids, the ones who translate hospital words into street words and equips them with tools, then you're not just solving disease spread. You're helping life spread. Trust, action, real change." The phrase hung in the air. Helping life spread. It shifted something intangible in the room. The coach looked from the model to Leo and back again, then nodded slowly. "We can't rebuild the whole project overnight," he said, "but we can reframe the core. Integrate some of that logic, at least in the way we present it." It was a small opening, but Leo knew doors rarely flew wide the first time you knocked. Sometimes they creaked, suspicious and slow, and you had to wedge your foot in before they closed again. He spent the next few hours rewriting parts of the control algorithm, adjusting parameters so the robot prioritized outreach in areas labeled by the simulation as low trust, high risk. His teammates, still skeptical, reluctantly followed his lead when they saw the model's projections begin to improve in ways their previous tweaks hadn't managed. In the audience, blending among other attendees, Marcos watched the transformation. He'd rearranged his schedule to be there when Leo's team presented, ignoring the puzzled looks from organizers who expected him in VIP lounges. He wanted to see, with his own eyes, whether the spark he'd glimpsed on the plane and in that cramped hostel could survive this harsh, bright arena. As teams took the stage, one by one, he saw polished demos, flawless interfaces, impressive numbers, yet most of them felt strangely detached from the messiness of real life. When Leo's team was finally called, his heart beat faster than it did before most of his own speeches. The three original members stepped forward first, explaining the technical framework. They spoke of sensor networks, predictive mapping, resource allocation. It sounded solid, if familiar. Then, almost as an afterthought at first glance, they gestured to Leo. "One of our teammates proposed a different layer," one of them said, the word teammate carrying a tiny hint of new respect. "We'd like him to explain it." Leo's name appeared on the screen. No titles, just him. He took a breath and walked up, hoodie still on, hands trembling slightly until he grabbed the clicker and anchored them to something. He didn't start with numbers. He started with a story. A street in Liverpool where people lined up at a clinic but left without being seen. A mother juggling shifts. A neighbor who acted as unofficial translator for health instructions. A kid who became the tech one because he could make broken things work again. "Maps are honest about where people live," he said, voice steadying as he went. "But they're not honest about who people listen to." On the screen, the simulation updated, tiny icons marking not just households and infection points, but community anchors, the unofficial leaders, helpers, and connectors. "Our system doesn't just chase the disease," he continued. "It chases the relationships that can stop it. It uses the robot as a bridge, not a boss." The judges leaned in. The projection showed how, by prioritizing these anchors, the spread curve bent faster than in control scenarios. Not perfectly. Reality never follows a perfectly smooth line, but clearly better. One judge asked a technical question about the trade-off between prediction granularity and outreach efficiency. Leo answered with a mix of math and metaphor, explaining how sometimes you accept a tiny loss in theoretical precision to gain a huge leap in human engagement. Another judge asked about implementation in different cultures. He didn't pretend to have all the answers. Instead, he said, every neighborhood has its own version of the people you don't see in official reports, but everyone knows. The system's job is to find them, not replace them. That humility, backed by lived reality, landed harder than any rehearsed slogan. In the back of the hall, Marcos felt something inside him unclench. This was what he'd been missing in his own work. Not just intelligence or innovation, but rootedness in truth that didn't shrink from the rough edges of the world. Leo wasn't trying to impress, he was trying to be honest. The applause at the end of the presentation started polite, then grew. It wasn't the explosive roar of a stadium, but it carried a different kind of weight. His teammates looked at him differently now, not as a last-minute add-on, but as the backbone of what made their project stand out. Even the coach's expression had shifted from guarded to openly proud. Small revenges against prejudice, playing out in real time, powered not by bitterness but by undeniable clarity. The waiting for the final result stretched like a rubber band. Teams paced, whispered, refreshed leaderboards that hadn't been updated yet. Outside, the sky had cleared, letting a pale sun spill across the plaza. Leo stood just beyond the venue doors, backpack at his feet, hands shoved deep into his pockets. He tried not to imagine the announcement. Either way, he'd be getting on a plane back to Liverpool soon, stepping into the same narrow corridors, the same familiar shadows. Part of him was terrified that, if they lost, this would all feel like proof that he'd dared too high. Another part quietly insisted that what he'd done couldn't be erased by a decision from a panel, no matter what names they read out. That part sounded suspiciously like the truth, the version of himself that refused to stay small. Inside, Marcos checked his phone again. A new message from the hospital waited. His chest tightened. He opened it. A photo loaded slowly, then came into focus. Anna, propped up slightly in bed, hair messy, eyes tired but awake, holding Clara against her chest. The baby's tiny hand pressed against her mother's collarbone. The caption beneath, from a nurse, "Someone insisted on saying hi to Dad before her nap." The wave that hit him then was bigger than any he'd felt on stage, bigger than any closing bell on a stock exchange. Relief crashed into him, unstoppable, washing away layers of fear and pretense. For a moment, the busy hall dissolved. There was only that image, that fragile proof that life was still on his side. When the announcement began, he barely heard the first categories, mentions, special awards, honorable recognitions. It all blurred until the host's tone shifted, signaling the main prize. "This year's top award," the voice echoed, "goes to a team that not only built a technically impressive system, but also dared to redefine what impact looks like when you're dealing with real people, not just data points." The screen flashed the name of Leo's team. For a second, silence. Then the sound barrier broke. Cheers, clapping, a few surprised shouts. Leo's teammates grabbed him, pulling him into an embrace he didn't quite know how to return at first. His feet moved toward the stage, as if he were walking in someone else's life. On stage, the trophy felt heavier than it looked. Metal and glass, sure, but also years of late nights, doubts, rolled eyes from teachers, and quiet self-promises whispered on bus rides. He held it up briefly, not in a triumphant, arrogant pose, but like someone offering proof that impossible things sometimes do happen. In that same moment, back in Madrid, Anna blinked sleepily at her phone as a video call request came in. A nurse helped her prop it up. The image fractured for a second, then stabilized, showing Leo under the bright competition lights, trophy in hand, a little stunned, a little overwhelmed. Marcos appeared beside him in the crowd, phone raised, eyes shining in a way his board had never seen. The call connected. On his screen, Clara's face appeared, curious and slightly confused, framed by the pale blue of hospital sheets. Her tiny mouth moved in a half-formed sound, somewhere between a yawn and a question. Inna smiled weakly, emotion pooling in the corners of her eyes. "We made it through the night," she said. "Both of us." Marcos swallowed hard. He turned the camera so Leo's image filled most of the frame. "Anna," he said, voice thick, "this is the kid I told you about. The one who helped on the plane. He just won." Leo, realizing he was suddenly part of a moment far bigger than any competition, gave a small, awkward wave. Clara squealed at the movement, reaching for the screen. That simple gesture, a baby's hand reaching toward a boy who had once thought the world would never really see him, felt like a thread tying 3 lives together across countries, classes, and fears. In that moment, trophies, salaries, resumes, and hospital machines all faded into the background. What remained was something quieter, but infinitely more powerful, proof that compassion, courage, and truth can stretch across miles and circumstances, creating bridges where there used to be walls. The sky outside the venue hadn't changed, but everything underneath it had shifted, at least for them. Later, when the lights dimmed and the crowd dispersed, they stood together just outside the hall, Marcos, Leo, and a glowing phone screen with Anna and Clara on the other side. Plans began to take shape not as grand speeches, but as simple, grounded commitments. Marcos talked about creating a program that didn't just scout talent from the usual places, but actively went into neighborhoods like Leo's and his own old one in Madrid to find the kids who'd been solving real problems in silence. Leo didn't ask for charity. Instead, he asked for partnership, access to labs, mentors who actually listened, and a chance to help design tools that made sense to the people who needed them most. They agreed that whatever they built next would honor the lesson of that flight, that the ones sitting in the back, carrying their worlds in taped-up bags, often hold keys the front row has forgotten to look for. The currency of what they were about to start wasn't just money or recognition. It was trust, shared purpose, and a kind of revenge that didn't seek to crush anyone, but to rewrite the script so fewer people had to fight from the shadows. The truth about who mattered and who could change things had stepped out into the open, impossible to unsee. As they said goodbye for now, with promises of calls, documents to draw up, and flights to plan, Leo slung his backpack over one shoulder. It felt a little lighter, not because it carried less, but because he finally knew its contents had somewhere bigger to go than just back home. Marcos watched him walk away, not with the distant gaze of a benefactor, but with the recognition of someone looking at a younger, braver reflection. The journey they'd shared in the air had only lasted 3 hours. The real flight, the one that began when a boy stood up in a crowded cabin to calm a screaming baby, was only just taking off. And this time, the path ahead wasn't drawn by status or fear, but by a simple, stubborn belief. When compassion becomes the real currency between people, the truth has a way of winning over every shadow it touches.